My message this morning comes from John chapter 9, and I want to read verses 1 to 16. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, Go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. Therefore the neighbours and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, Is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, Yeah, this is he. And others said, No, he's like him. And he said, I am he. Therefore they said to him, How were your eyes opened? And he answered and said, A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. Then they said to him, Where is he? And he said, I do not know. They brought him, who formerly was blind, to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. And others said, How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. I've entitled this message, The Common Senses. For me, this chapter is all about the five senses. It's about sight, having eyes to see, seeing through the lies, seeing beyond the present, seeing above the clouds. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence does my help come? My help, it comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Verse 25 said, This one thing I know, though I was blind, now I see. And it's about hearing, and we're told in Scripture that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Verse 11b, He told me to go to the pool of Siloam and wash, so I went and washed. It's about touch. Peter's mother-in-law, when he touched her hand, the fever left her. And the lady that said, If only I can touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. This man in verse 11 said, A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. He touched my eyes. It's about taste. Psalm 34 verse 8 says, O taste and see that the Lord is good. In verse 29 of chapter 9, these Pharisees said, We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. And the man who was blind answered and said to them, verse 30, This is a marvellous thing, that you do not know where he is from. Yet he has opened my eyes. O taste and see that the Lord is good. It's about smell. Ephesians 5, 1 and 2. Therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Verse 4 of chapter 9 says, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. the sweet, sweet smell of good works. It's always fresh. So this chapter, for me, is all about the five senses. And aren't they amazing? You know how they work, don't you? No? You want me to explain them? Well, I don't know either. I could say that nerves send impulses to the brain that make these common senses work. But what does that mean? It means that we are all walking miracles. And to lose any of these senses is going to be hardship. Yet, God has made a provision that even in these hardships, we can overcome. The man in chapter 9 was born blind, and we need to stop and consider what that might have meant. We read Jesus passed by and saw a man who was blind from birth. In other words, he never saw his parents, but he felt them and he heard them. They taught him, and they taught him to speak, and he learned and he listened. He never saw water, but he felt it, and he was refreshed by it. He never saw food, but he could smell it, and he could taste it. He never saw a flower, but he could feel it, and then he could smell its perfume. He never saw anything, but he could imagine everything. He never saw God, but he knew of him, and he wanted to know more. These common senses that we have lead us beyond the imaginations of the mind to the reality of God, if we allow them to the heart of our Creator, beyond the flesh to a spiritual life. Verse 39, and Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. And some of the Pharisees said to him, are we blind also? My life has been spent emphasizing the spiritual life as being above and beyond anything else. And so I get excited when I discover the spiritual life in this young man. I think he was young because when his parents were asked by the religious leaders, if this is your son who was born blind, how then does he now see? And they answered and said, don't ask us, we don't know, ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. And so that just suggests to me that he's not too old. The fear of these rulers overshadowed any joy that the parents might have had with their son's healing. The word was out there that anyone who acknowledges Jesus as the Christ would be excommunicated from the synagogue. Sounds like modern day leadership, doesn't it? Disagree with me and you're fired. They even went as far as broadcasting this miracle as a hoax. Verse 18, but the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been born blind and had now received his sight. It's a hoax, they said. Now, does that sound familiar to anyone? We'll talk about it later. They again call this man into a meeting to interrogate him, and they get more than what they'd bargained for. But think of the poor man. Imagine one of the first things you see, having never seen, one of the first things you see are these hard-faced, stiff-necked Pharisees, the ones you'd been listening to for most of your life. I reckon it was horrible for him, but he handled it well. They begin by trying to make him feel guilty. They say to him, don't go glorifying this man Jesus. Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. Well, he says, whether he's a sinner or not, There's one thing I do know. Once I was blind, but now I see. And they said, but how did he open your eyes? And he could have answered again with details like, well, he made a muddy mixture of spit and dirt. Then he anointed my eyes with it. And he told me to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. But no, he didn't say that. He just said, well, why do you keep asking me? Do you want to become his disciples too? And this annoyed them, and they got angry with him. Verse 28 tells us that they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't know anything about this fellow. And now that the message begins, the spiritual life starts to flow, and I love it. I love the way he spoke and the way he, you could say, argued. Well, he says, this is a marvellous thing. You don't know where he is from, but he has opened my eyes. You say he is a sinner, but we know God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, then God hears him. Let me tell you, since the world began, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man Jesus were not from God, he could do nothing. Wow, what do you think of that? I told you he was a spiritual man. He hasn't even had a chance to look around yet. But he addresses them in spirit and in power. And the best these religious leaders can do, the best they could do in response is, how dare you assume to teach us? You were completely born in sins, a blind beggar all your life. How dare you lecture us? And then to top it off, they throw him out. They throw him out of the place. Verse 34 tells us they cast him out. And it's an interesting thing that they relate his hardship to sin. And so did the disciples. When they first saw him, they said in verse 2, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And it's obvious that the teaching of the day was that hardship, sickness and suffering were a punishment from God because of someone's sins or someone's mistakes. If you're sick, you must deserve it. If you're poor, then you're a lazy, good-for-nothing sinner. If you're down, then the heavy hand of God is upon you. You'll have to suffer. What do you want us to do about it? But this teaching and this thinking is all wrong. Yet it has been carried over to this very day. Jesus makes it clear that this man has not been being punished because of someone else's sin. He's not a victim of being more sinful than anyone else. In fact, the opposite is true. If you're going to tell me that the wealthy of this world and the healthy of this world carry the blessing of God, and at the same time can oppress and ignore the poor, the sick and the suffering, then I'd have to say that you're sadly mistaken. Are you saying we are blind too? Verse 41, Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but now you say that we see. Therefore your sin remains. There is none so blind as he who will not see. Helen Keller said, it's a sad thing to have sight but no vision. The common senses. While this man had no sense of sight, all his other senses became highly or finely tuned. He heard things that most don't hear. He felt things that are rarely handled. He could appreciate the fragrance of the roses. He could taste what the glutton never gives time for. He could see beyond sight. Our common senses can often be underrated or poorly appreciated or even overridden. And I fear that our world has become a picture of the blind leading the blind. We might have this wonderful sight, but there is so much we don't see because we don't know how to look or where to look. I was asked recently to do a job for a couple who had a leaky shower in their ensuite. It had been leaking for a long time, but they didn't know because they never looked under the house. The husband's wardrobe backed onto the shower recess, and although a musty smell was coming from it, the wife thought, well, that's just what men's clothes smell like. Might have been smelling his socks, I don't know. But these wardrobes are also, don't they? They get packed with things that might never see the light of day again. And till the time comes when we think, I'm bored or it's raining, I might clean the wardrobe out. And that's what happened. And then the discovery was made. Water leaking from the shower into the wardrobe. The floor of the wardrobe was damp. And so it was cut out for further investigation. And then besides things being wet, they found a termite nest. The dark, moist area with hardwood bears and joists, along with soft pine frame, that was a termite's heaven. So I come on the scene and I have to take the shower floor up and the tiled walls off that area. And when I had done that, I saw a mess like I've never seen before in my life. The timber had been eaten away with just the barest structure left. Unfortunately, brickwork was holding up the roof trusses because the timber frame certainly wasn't. And these things had to be revealed. They had to be looked at. They had to be seen for what they were. Then they had to be removed, and that was a messy job. And then they had to be rebuilt. So much corruption in our world needs to be looked at. It needs to be revealed and not covered up and not glossed over. Jesus said in verse 5, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Revealing things, showing things for what they are, presenting the honest truth, showing the way to go. By ignoring his teachings, by rejecting his morals and refusing his commands, we are actually covering a white ant nest that is destroying the foundations of our society. Instead of dressing up the problem or even dressing down the problem, like complaining about the smell, we need to do more. We need to remove the rubbish, pull down the damaged framework. And yeah, that will make a mess. That will upset people. No doubt. But it does need to be done. Jeremiah knows all about that. Look at his life. Look at the call on Jeremiah's life to reveal, to pull down and to build up. And it does make a mess to start with, but it's worth it in the end. Today I feel we've allowed the basic structures of, marriage and faithfulness, of wholesome family life, we've allowed them to be eaten away. And not even that verbal disgust or the emotional plea, they won't remedy the situation. Something has to be done. It won't or let me say the appearance of a moral base is no substitute for the real thing. It has to go beyond words. Our church structures must be rebuilt. Our society systems must be renewed, or our collapse will be sooner and surer than we could ever have imagined. Let us use common sense. Better still, employ all the common senses, sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell in the work of God. And let us do it while it is day, while it is still possible. For as Jesus said, the night is coming when no one can work. Amen.
Greater and he raised up Jairus' daughter. He fed the hungry, cleansed the leper. But we need Jesus now more than ever. Jesus now more than ever. We are sailing in stormy weather. All his children should get together, for we need Jesus now more than ever. He touched the lame man and he started walking. He touched the dumb man and he started talking. He put their lives all back together. But we need Jesus now more than ever. Jesus now, more than ever. We are sailing in stormy weather. All his children should get together, for we need Jesus now more than ever. In the book of Revelation, you read about the tribulation. We are headed in that direction. Only Jesus' blood can give protection. Jesus now, more than ever. We are sailing in stormy weather. All his children should get together, for we need Jesus now more than ever. Jesus now,
Jesus now,
more than ever.
more than ever.
We are sailing in stormy weather. All his children should get together, for we need Jesus now more than ever. For we need, yes we need, Jesus now more than ever.
I'm going to now invite Alyssa Hicks to the stage. She's someone who has not seen the light of day, nor the color of a rose. And she, though, sees Jesus. And it's because he lives that Alyssa, who can't see, has hope. And the limbless conductor conducts an orchestra with his shoulders. Because Jesus lives is why I have hope. If you haven't found hope yet, he's knocking at your door. Let him in. Ladies and gentlemen, Alyssa Hicks, because he lives.